Looking back on the past is important to learn from experience.
Farhad Badalbeyli, godfather of Azerbaijani classical music. A son of the Caucasus, raised in the heart of Baku. Keeper of all that can be neither bought nor broken. In his hands, the traditions of Azerbaijan live on. The metronome falls silent and Baku holds its breath while the music plays on.
I came here when I was 5 years old. I'm 78 now, so you can say I've spent almost my entire life here.
I'd like to start with your parents. You were born in Baku, and so was your mother, while your father came from Shusha. Can you tell us what was the atmosphere like in your home? Is there a particular memory, perhaps even a particular smell that you associated with?
The smell of the theater. My father was a theater director, and all the portraits you'll probably see here are of great Azerbaijani composers. They often came to our home because they worked with my father on productions. These were people like Tofik Guliev, Arif Melikov, Fikrat Amirov, Suleiman Alasgarov, and Said Rustamov, some of Azerbaijan's finest artists. Sometimes they even rehearsed at our house. For me, the theater has always felt like home. I've known the smell of the backstage area since childhood. My uncle was also a distinguished conductor and composer, Farhad Badalbeyli, the author of Azerbaijan's first national ballet, Maiden Tower. So there was always a very artistic atmosphere in our home. At our amateur theater, we staged Chekhov's A Malefactor. I remember playing a gendarme. We put on that production when I was 8 years old.
Staying on the subject, you once mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, that when you were 7 years old, your father took you to see his production of the Georgian opera Daisy.
Yes, Daisy.
And during the final act, every time the dramatic climax came, you would burst into tears. That brings me to my next question. When was the last time concert, opera, theatrical performance moved you to tears, and why?
It was Aida performed by La Scala when they came to Moscow. I cried throughout the entire performance, and I wasn't a child anymore. I was already an adult, perhaps 25, maybe 30 years old. The performance was of such an extraordinary standard. We hadn't heard anything like it for a very long time, and it was performed entirely in Italian. In the Soviet Union, operas were usually staged in Russian or Azerbaijani, often in translation. It was quite rare to hear them performed in their original language. I love the theater. In many ways, it means even more to me than my own solo performances.
Let's move on to your teachers. You studied with some remarkable musicians, Yakov Zak, Bela Davidovich. You always speak about that period with great warmth. Can you remember any occasions when your teachers made some kind of sacrifice in order to pass on the knowledge to their students? And more broadly, how would you compare the education system of that time with today's?
Unfortunately, as a rector, I have to admit that today's education system is less humanistic. In the past, there was genuine contact between teacher and student. Today, everything has become far more mechanical. There are endless tests that require standardized answers. What worries me is that many young people can no longer express their own thoughts properly. The dialogue has disappeared. A teacher comes in, gives an assignment, the students complete it, and that's the end of it. Of course, music is different because personal contact is essential. But the atmosphere at the Moscow Conservatory in the 1960s and 1970s was something truly extraordinary. I don't even know how to describe it. For those of us who experienced it, it was like a fairy tale. There were people such as Rector, Gilels, Fleer, Zak, Oborin, Oistrach, Kogan, and Rostropovich. They loved talking to students and often helped them whenever they ran into difficulties with their teachers. Those memories are unforgettable. And it wasn't only about professional training. When Yakov Israelovich Zak and I traveled to Lisbon for a competition, we stopped in Paris on the way because direct travel wasn't possible at the time. The moment we arrived, he took me straight to the Louvre. Incidentally, we stayed in what is now the Musée d'Orsay. Back then, in 1968, it was still a railway station and a hotel. Whenever I visit the museum today, I'm amazed to think that I once lived there. Zak knew every gallery, every painting. He collected reproductions of great works of art and was especially passionate about Spanish painters. I remember how outraged he was that the French had placed the Spanish masters in some remote corner of the museum. All of this exposure to great artists and writers was part of our education. It wasn't simply a matter of coming in, playing well and going home. No, it was an education in taste, an education in character. That's why I remember him with such affection, respect, and gratitude. And then there was my dear Bella Hanum, as I always called her, one of the greatest interpreters of Chopin who ever lived. She would always laugh when I referred to her as simply a Chopin specialist. What am I? Only a Chopinist, she would say. And of course she wasn't. She was a magnificent interpreter of Schumann and performed the entire classical repertoire beautifully. But in my opinion, nobody has ever played Chopin's mazurkas the way Bela Davidovich did. It was perfection.
Как играл Бела Давидович, никому не удавалось. Это как это совершенство было. Счастлив, что дружу с ее.
I'm also fortunate to be friends with her son, Dmitry Sitkovetsky, the outstanding violinist. He visits Azerbaijan frequently and often takes part in our Gabala festival. My first teacher, Major Rafaelovich Brenner, also played an enormous role in my life. He taught at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. He was a true professional and an exceptional teacher. I owe him a great deal, so yes, I was very lucky with my teachers.
Что, на ваш взгляд, первично? By the way, what do you think is more important in shaping outstanding people? Exceptional teachers or the educational system itself? Которого появляются такие личности.
Но там совпало.
In our case, both came together. The system was right and the people were right. The Russian piano school remains one of the finest in the world. I don't want to pretend everything was perfect back then. It wasn't. There were problems too. Even poor Yakov Israelovich sometimes found himself in trouble if one of his students fell behind. He had to answer to party committees and attend endless meetings. There were plenty of absurdities. But strangely enough, the resistance of our generation, the desire to think independently despite all the restrictions, produced extraordinary results. In the 1960s and 1970s, even with all the tensions of the post-Stalin period, remarkable works of art were created. Do we see works of that scale today? Personally, I don't. I don't see new Shostakovich symphonies. I don't see figures on the scale of Richter or Gilels. Of course, there are talented musicians, many talented musicians, but those titans, perhaps the age of the titans has passed, and the world we live in today gives us little reason for optimism.
Повода для оптимизма.
Let's go back to your early successes. Your first major achievement. When you were 20 years old, you won a prize at the Bedřich Smetana International Piano Competition in Hradec Králové.
I won third prize.
Yes, third place. For a young Azerbaijani pianist at that time, that was a tremendous achievement. How did you manage to stay grounded afterward?
Учителя.
My teachers, above all, my teachers, Yakov Israelevich Zak, had a famous piece of advice. After a concert, never listen to your relatives or friends. Find a critic, preferably a harsh one, who will point out your weaknesses. To this day, I can hardly remember a single concert with which I was completely satisfied. Well, perhaps there have been one or two. I remember a performance in Bratislava with the outstanding conductor Veronika Dudarova, may she rest in peace, and the Moscow Symphony Orchestra. I played Saint-Saëns. Perhaps that was one of the very few occasions when I felt I had little to criticize in my own performance. But such moments are rare. Most of the time I look for shortcomings. That principle has allowed me to keep working on myself throughout my life, because the moment a person becomes completely satisfied with themselves, they are in danger.
Опасности большая.
Возвращаясь к тому, что вы сказали о... Speaking of technical mastery, I'd like to refer to something you said in an interview with Baku Worker newspaper in March 1973. You said that technical skill alone is not enough to make someone a true musician. Without broader intellectual development and wider outlook, it's impossible to become a complete artist. So where is the balance between technical excellence and broader understanding of history, philosophy, literature, and arts?
Я боюсь.
I'm afraid many young musicians today no longer receive that kind of education. We were trained differently. Of course, there was Marxism, Leninism, which everyone was required to study, but there were also remarkable teachers who taught philosophy in the truest sense of the word. Some of them even secretly lent us books that were considered forbidden at the time, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and others. In the Soviet Union, such books circulated almost underground. How can you truly understand German music if you know nothing about Goethe, Heine, Kant, or German philosophy? You cannot fully understand Wagner without Schopenhauer. You cannot understand him without Nietzsche. There are certain things an artist simply must know. You need to understand the world around you. You must be able to imagine the spirit of the age in which a composer lived and worked. Only then can you truly understand the music.
Того времени, в котором творил композитор.
Возвращаясь к вашему отцу, going back to your father and the subject of cultural exchange, including productions such as Daisy, your father was closely involved in cultural relations between the Soviet republics.
Yes, he was.
How has cultural exchange changed since then? Is it even possible to compare the two eras?
Нет, сравнивать невозможно.
No, it really isn't. The Soviet Union had many shortcomings, but one thing it did exceptionally well was foster cultural exchange between the republics. People often say there was no genuine friendship between nations, perhaps not in the way we understand it today. But there was a huge amount of organized work dedicated to bringing people together. Significant resources were allocated to it. This wasn't merely ideology. It was state policy. There were conferences, symposiums, festivals, competitions, and countless cultural exchanges throughout the South Caucasus and beyond. The process never stopped. The state actively encouraged it. That has to be acknowledged. Then history took a different course. The republics gained independence. We ourselves spent decades fighting to reclaim our rightful lands. Naturally, contacts became far less frequent than they had been during Soviet times.
Чтобы отвоевать свои законные земли. И поэтому, как бы...
However, in terms of quality, many important connections still remain. Take the Gabala Festival, for example. We welcome artists from Georgia, Moscow, London, Tel Aviv, and many other places. I've always believed that international exchange is essential in the arts. The moment you lock yourself inside a narrow national circle, you risk becoming provincial. And provincialism inevitably leads to a decline in professional standards. The Heydar Aliyev Foundation has also done tremendous work by bringing outstanding artists to Azerbaijan. Even the foundation's building itself is a masterpiece of architecture, the result of collaboration with some of the world's finest architects. That is exactly why these international connections should be encouraged and strengthened wherever possible. Of course, I understand that governments have many priorities and many challenges, but professionalism, culture, and spirituality all require support. And none of them can flourish in isolation. They need dialogue with the wider world.
Которую надо поддерживать. А ее поддерживать без международных контактов невозможно.
Essentially, you've spent your entire life here.
Yes.
You witnessed Baku both during the Soviet era and independent Azerbaijan. What has changed most fundamentally, and what has remained the same despite the passing of time?
На то, что поменялись эпохи.
Сравнивать то и то нет. Но
There's really no comparison, but the fact that we gained independence is an immense blessing. No one tells us how we should live anymore from Moscow. And equally, we wouldn't want anyone in Brussels telling us how to live either. We want to live according to our own choices. At the same time, there are universal values that we should always respect and listen to.
конечно, изменилась атмосфера Баку.
Of course, the atmosphere in Baku has changed. The Baku of those years was very different. Today, the national identity plays a much stronger role, naturally, because Azerbaijani has become the state language. Our institutions, our official activities, and our meetings are conducted in Azerbaijani. As a result, the audience that once existed in Baku has changed and dispersed, but every era has its own charm.
Такой бакинский дух, КВН, Каракараев со своей.
There was a unique Baku spirit back then. There was KVN, there was Kara Karayev experimenting with new compositional techniques, new ideas and artistic movements. Today, a different generation has emerged. Many of them study in Paris or London. They no longer speak Russian as their primary foreign language. They speak English or French. They have their own worldview, their own heroes, and their own aspirations. What gives me hope is that our young people have shown that they are prepared to stand up for their country. We saw that clearly. That is an extremely important thing. Perhaps it is the most important thing of all.
Важный момент. Может быть, важнее всего это.
С 2009 года вы
Since 2009, you have been the artistic director of the Gabala International Music Festival. Looking back over the past 15 years, how would you describe the festival's development, its repertoire, its audience, and its international standing? After all, so many world-class musicians have performed there.
и огромное количество музыкантов с мировым уровнем.
Безусловно. И я должен отметить.
Absolutely. But first I must acknowledge the role of Dima Yablonsky, with whom we launched the festival. His contribution cannot be overstated. It would be unfair for me to take all the credit myself. What can I say? I remember how in the beginning we constantly asked ourselves how we could make it work. The festival takes place in a region where many people had never even seen a symphony orchestra, let alone attended a classical concert. That's why we introduced an idea before every performance. We invited Professor Zakra Gulieva, a wonderful educator, to speak to the audience in Azerbaijani and explain the composers and the music they were about to hear. People weren't simply arriving and sitting through a concert. They were entering the world of the music beforehand. We also wanted the festival to be open to everyone, not just to an elite audience, as is often the case with major international festivals. Those festivals already have knowledgeable audiences who don't need introductions. Our goal was different. This is a democratic festival. Most importantly, it is free. There are very few festivals of this caliber anywhere in the world that are completely free to the public. And that, I believe, is one of its greatest achievements. People began coming not only from Gabala, but from Ganja, Sheki, and neighboring regions, people who might otherwise never have had access to the music of Tchaikovsky, Brahms, or Beethoven. If we've managed to bring that experience to them, then I'm happy. These days, it's a little more difficult because we are rebuilding Karabakh. It's a shame you didn't see what it looked like 5 years ago. 5 years ago, there was virtually nothing there. Today, there are beautiful new buildings, concert venues, and cultural centers. There is now a wonderful concert hall in Agdam. Agdam was completely destroyed. Not a single building was left standing. And now outstanding musicians are performing there. I hope this process continues. It must continue. We cannot stop.
Надо продолжать. Нельзя останавливаться.
Вот скажите, а вот
Was it difficult to establish international cooperation for the festival?
народные восприятия как-то фестиваля? Как
Конечно, было тяжело.
Of course it was. It required an enormous amount of work. But once again, the local authorities and our sponsors played a crucial role. They helped us bring world-class artists and ensembles to Gabala. We welcomed leading orchestras, distinguished conductors, Denis Matsuev, and many other outstanding musicians. We hosted remarkable ensembles, flamenco performers from Spain, and artists from all over the world. None of this happened by accident. It took years of effort and relationship building. Today it's even more difficult than it was before, without any
Мы
doubt.
стараемся сейчас, но нам сейчас гораздо труднее, безусловно.
правда ли?
By the way, is it true that the festival became much bigger and more significant than you originally expected?
Да,
Yes, absolutely.
What were your expectations when you first started?
мы думали раз, два, три.
To be honest, we didn't really know what would happen. We thought perhaps some things would work and others wouldn't. We certainly didn't expect the level of support we eventually received from the state and from our sponsors. Without them, none of this would have been possible. And I'm deeply grateful to all the international stars who came to Gabala. Perhaps we couldn't always offer the highest fees, but somehow we managed to attract them with something else. The beauty of the region, the atmosphere, the hospitality, and of course the food. I remember joking that many of our foreign guests went home 3 or 4 kilos heavier than when they arrived. That always amused them and left a wonderful impression. Somehow it all came together.
Получилось. Вы знаете, музыканты...
You know, musicians themselves have a responsibility. They carry a special mission. They are not simply performers, they are educators and ambassadors of culture. If you don't make the effort to engage people, they will simply go somewhere else. It's very easy to blame the audience and say, they don't understand us. You know, that's the easiest excuse in the world. You know, the real challenge is to make people interested. You have to understand what you want to achieve, why you're doing it, and how you're going to communicate it. Only then can you truly connect with an audience. I remember once I played for ordinary lady workers back in Soviet Union and heard someone say after a concert, well, you promised to sing, but you didn't sing. Those kinds of comments stay with you. That's life in the concert world.
Вот такие даже были концерты.
Вы говорили, то, что никогда не бываете практически никогда.
You mentioned earlier that you're rarely satisfied with your own performances. Shostakovich, for example, spent much of his later life criticizing himself. In letters to friends, he wrote that he had made compromises and blamed himself for them. Richter was much the same. Whenever people praised him, he would downplay his achievements and speak critically of himself, as for example in the documentary of Mont Saint John. What advice would you give to people who struggle to assess their own abilities objectively, how can they remain self-critical without losing confidence?
результаты. Как держать баланс?
На протяжении своей
Over the course of my rather long life, I've come across quite a few narcissists, forgive me for saying so, but complete fools, who simply could not be persuaded to doubt their own greatness, even for a moment. I would tell them, gentlemen, just look around you. Look at Bach, Brahms, Shostakovich, Garagarayev. Measure yourselves against them. I'm talking about people who create, composers, artists, creative individuals who somehow forget that there was a Michelangelo, that there was a Raphael before them. I honestly don't know whether that's the result of a lack of knowledge or a deeply rooted sense of self-satisfaction. But I can tell you frankly, giving such people advice is completely useless.
советы, скажу вам откровенно, совершенно бесполезны. Что касается Рихтера и...
As for Richter and Shostakovich, I think that is the self-criticism of the gods. I really do, because they were geniuses among geniuses. I am now working on Shostakovich's trio. How else could a person describe his era if not through genius music? It is like a chronicle, page by page. War, Auschwitz, love, humor, all the weaknesses and strengths of a human being are there. By the way, he was the teacher of both Jovdat Hajiev and Garagarayev, our great composers. He came to Baku, and in his 10th symphony there is a story. He was madly in love with our wonderful professor Elmira Nazirova. He loved her, but she was married, and his love was unfulfilled. El-mi-ra. He translated the letters into notes, and in the 10th symphony, he repeats those notes 13 times.
Воет эти ноты. В этом он выразил все свои чувства.
In that way, he expressed all his feelings. It is a real cry in her name. Those were the kinds of geniuses who came here. You ask who came, what influence they had. Rostropovich came here for 10 years in a row. He gave master classes here. I had the honor of performing with him. He conducted. Entire festivals were held in his name. The communication with the extraordinary musicians he brought to Baku, all of that was international contact. All of that was communication. God forbid that this communication should ever stop.
Не дай Бог это общение прекратить.
Вы замечаете,
Do you notice how digitalization, artificial intelligence, and similar technologies are affecting not only the training of young musicians, but also the way they perceive and relate to music?
или отношение к музыке, или подход?
Знаете, здесь я боюсь быть ретроградом.
You know, here I am, afraid of sounding retrograde. Perhaps artificial intelligence can help with instantly translating necessary materials. I mean, purely from the practical side. Perhaps it is very necessary. A person immediately receives some kind of advice, but the process itself is also a little frightening.
Чуть пугает.
Вот скажите, у вас было в жизни...
Tell me, have you ever made a musical or personal decision in your life that you would make differently today?
Но есть многое то, что...
There are many things I wanted to do when I was younger, but simply didn't have time for. That is what I regret. There are projects that were never realized. There are quite a few of them, and that is painful. At a certain point, there is nothing you can do about it anymore because you no longer have the same strength or energy.
Силы не те.
А вот какими
And
качествами
what
для вас
qualities
должен
should a
обладать
true friend possess, in your view?
Верность.
Loyalty, above all loyalty.
Верность.
Возвращаясь к вашим родителям.
And finally, returning to your parents, if you had an opportunity to play right now just one music piece for them, only one, what would it be?
Я бы хотел им показать свое.
I would like to show them my C. They heard the piece before, but they never heard it performed with an orchestra. in liberated Shusha, if you manage to show it, I performed C with the orchestra together with my student Murad. I would have liked them to hear it that way.
Вот я бы хотел им это показать.